Meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 83 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, and pursuant to Standing Order 108(2) and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, November 21st, 2022, the committee is meeting to discuss the economic and fiscal outlook and the report of the Bank of Canada on monetary policy. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23rd, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefits of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Now I'd like to welcome our witness for the first panel, which will be from 11 to 11:30-ish. And with us today from the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer is the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Monsieur Yves Giroux, is with us. And now the floor is yours, Monsieur Giroux, for opening remarks.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mesdames et Messieurs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. I am pleased to be here to discuss my office's most recent economic and fiscal outlook, which was published on March 2, 2023, before the tabling of the budget. Our outlook provides a baseline projection to help parliamentarians. Our report seeks to help parliamentarians gauge potential economic and fiscal outcomes under current policy settings. On April 13th, my office published our issues report on Budget 2023. The report is designed to assist parliamentarians in their budgetary deliberations, highlighting key issues arising from the budget, which announced $69.7 billion in new spending measured on a gross basis.
On balance, the outlook for real GDP growth over 2023 to 2027 presented in Budget 23 is slightly weaker compared to our March outlook, with annual growth averaging respectively 1.6 and 1.7%. This slight difference reflects a weaker near-term outlook that includes a shallow recession in 2023 in the budget, whereas our March outlook projected the economy to stagnate over the course of the year. In terms of the fiscal outlook, when put on a comparable basis, our adjusted March projection shows budgetary deficits over 2022-23 to 2027-28 that are, on balance, in line with the outlook presented in Budget 2023. I would now be pleased to respond to any questions you may have regarding our economic and fiscal analysis or other PBO work. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Giroux.
Thank you, Mr. Giroux.
Go to the members, I'm going to say for the first round, but this will be the only round. Each party will have up to 6 minutes to ask questions. And we are starting with the Conservatives for 6 minutes. And I have MP Morantz, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's very nice to see you again, Mr. Giroux. It's a pleasure to have you here at our committee to discuss Budget 2023. I have read your report with interest, and I think the first thing I wanted to ask you about is this phenomenon of non-announced measures. It's a concern that's come up before. It came up in the Fall Economic Statement and even before that. You highlighted in your report, you identified $798 million in new non-announced measures, bringing, I think you said, the total to an excess of $12 billion. For those who might be watching who don't know what non-announced measures are, it's essentially the government asking us to vote to allow spending when we don't know at all what it's for, essentially giving the government a literal blank check of $12 billion. And I think you said in your testimony before that the difficulty you have with this is that it's very difficult from an accounting perspective to understand once the money is spent what it was actually spent on. So there's two problems here. there's a major transparency problem when parliamentarians are asked to approve monies that they don't know what it's for. And secondly, there's a major accountability problem because after the fact, it's impossible to find out what the money was spent on. I wonder if you could comment on that issue.
Sure. So it's not unusual for governments to have provisions for pressures that could materialize or for unforeseen events. What makes this one particularly challenging is that there are positives and negatives. So it suggests that there is a level of details that is quite high. So there's clearly planned spending that the government has a clear idea on, and decisions that are either made or almost made and for which the quantums are quite clear. So it's presented as an aggregate, so we don't have any clear idea, obviously, what's included. And the concern we have is that when the spending gets announced publicly, it's very difficult to trace it back to the source of funds. Was it budget 2023? Was it budget 2022? So it's very difficult to figure out what was the source of funds and is this new funding when it finally gets announced. So it's very difficult for us to follow that kind of money. And that's the main concerns we have with that.
Have you expressed your concern to department officials about this?
We've made our concerns known in reports, in discussions with departmental officials, and given that it's in reports, we know they read our reports, some of them very thoroughly, so they are well aware of our concerns.
Okay, and as parliamentarians, what do you think we should do about it? Do you think that this requires some sort of legislative mandate to ensure that this kind of thing doesn't happen in the future?
It's something that, as parliamentarians, you can ask further details on the part of the government. So you can, when ministers and officials testify, you could certainly ask them to provide you more details, either in writing or when they appear in committees.
You know, it's funny you should say that because I did exactly that when the Minister of Finance was here back in November. I asked her if she would table the details of all of the non-announced spending with the committee, and she refused to do that. So it seems like we've hit a bit of a wall in finding out what all of this non-announced spending is for. And it makes it very difficult for us as parliamentarians to vote on something that we don't know what the money is for. Now, I know part of your mandate is also economic analysis. So I'm just wondering what you think of the budget. Generally speaking, it's got $69.7 billion in new gross spending measures. I saw Derek Holt being interviewed on the weekend by Scotiabank saying that he thinks that all this profligate government spending has resulted in at least a 1% increase in the bank rate, which I had never heard an economist say before. I'm wondering if you would agree that government deficit spending is stimulatory in nature, is inflationary in nature, and has resulted in an actual increase in the bank rate above what it would have been had the government not embarked on such a massive spending spree.
So we did some analysis, not to translate the spending into how much of a rate increase it means, but looking at spending that is non-COVID related. And we find that in the absence of non-COVID related spending over the last couple of years, the deficit would be almost $26 billion lower each year on average, and the debt to GDP ratio would be 4.7 percentage points lower in 27-28 than projected in the last budget. On the part of your question that relates to the inflationary nature of government spending, the Bank of Canada's monetary policy report indicated last week that government spending, and by that they mean not only the federal but also provincial spending, overall stimulates aggregate demand, which is wording equivalent to providing inflation or stimulating inflation.
And thank you, MP Morantz. And now over to the Liberals, MP McDonald for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Grew, for being here again today. It's great to see you. Your news release that accompanied your report noted the cancellation of the $9 billion strategic policy review launched in Budget 22. But in my read of Budget 2023, I see a section entitled Refocusing Government Spending, which carries substantial financial savings of about $15 billion that go even further than the $9 billion proposed. Can you explain how these two programs differ?
It would be difficult for me to explain how they differ because the strategic policy reviews of Budget 2022 did not have that much details. So we inquired with Department of Finance officials as to what had happened with the strategic policy review in Budget 22 that was aiming at providing savings of $9 billion. We asked them if our interpretation that it had been canceled, was that correct? And they said that yes, it is correct. But you're right that there are additional or new spending restraint measures announced in the budget, refocusing government spending, notably reducing spending on consulting, professional services, and travel, as well as reducing eligible spending by government departments and agencies and in Crown Corps, which together total about $15 billion over a number of years. So cancellation of the strategic policy review, but new spending reviews for a total of $15 billion in the budget.
Thank you. Your report also notes that your projections for Canada's real GDP and unemployment are more optimistic than those laid out in Budget 2023. And can you explain what drives this difference and your opinion on it?
Sure. So in our estimate, we factor in, I think, faster inflation, GDP inflation, and I'm looking at the numbers here. So we have annual growth that's slightly faster, and the government includes or factors in a shallow recession in 2023, whereas we don't see that as the most likely scenario. It's possible that there'll be a shallow recession, but we see the most likely outlook or outcome for 2023 as being stagnant growth, whereas the government has a slightly more pessimistic scenario for 2023, which explains the bulk of the difference.
Thank you. And comparable to internationally to other countries, specifically G7 countries, on key fiscal measures like the net debt to GDP ratio, debt levels, and our deficit, where does Canada stand on their positioning to date, coming out of the past 2 years, basically, out of COVID-19?
When looking at G7 countries, Canada compares very favorably on net debt to GDP. On that note, I had a discussion with somebody from Moody's over the last several days, and when I expressed I talked about the prospects for Canada and deficits as a proportion of the economy being of about 1 to 1.5%. They looked at me and they said, you should be quite happy because by European standards, that's very low. So compared to G7 countries, we are doing comparably well, in good part because provinces are also near balanced budgets or small deficits, if you look at an aggregate, and we have pre-funded some of our public pension obligations. So compared to other countries, we are doing quite well.
Minutes.
And just in regards to Moody's and bond rating, can you just explain to maybe some of the people at home how important that is to maintain that bond rating within the...
Sure. So bond ratings by external rating agencies determine how market participants, investment portfolios, and institutional investors, they look at ratings we get from rating agencies to determine the interest rates they're willing to pay for Canadian government bonds. So having a favorable or high rating from a majority of these rating agencies allows Canada to finance its debt on more favorable terms than countries who don't benefit from the same debt rating. So it reduces what the government pays on its in interest, Canadian government, but also provincial governments.
And, you know, we've come through a tumultuous time, and we seem to be positioning ourselves. Our trajectory is very good right now for Canada, but you know, we don't know what lies ahead to some extent and how complicated it's going to get. But continuously, you read in the media about economists, and they have varying degrees of opinions on Canada's economy. And I guess, you know, if you were speaking to a board of trade in any city in this country, what would you say to them relevant to Canada's economy?
I would say that we have relatively good prospects when it comes to economic growth. We have a diverse economy with a wealth of natural resources. I would also, if I was talking to a board of trade, I would express concerns about the productivity level that we are seeing in Canada. So productivity growth is not as good as it could be. And it's something, certainly to talking to a board of trade, that I would encourage them to invest aggressively in areas that foster and improves productivity, because that's the key to longer-term economic growth. And we are unfortunately lagging compared to the U.S.
Thank you. Merci. Merci, MP McDonald. And now we are on to the block, and we have Marie with us. MP Sainte-Marie.
Thank you. Hello, Mr. Chairman. Hello, Mr. Giroux. First of all, a message for my colleagues. I sent you an email yesterday for an invitation. Mr. McDonald responded, not the others, so if ever you could follow up on that, I'd appreciate it. Mr. Giroux, thanks once again for your presence and your participation and all the work you and your team do. I greatly appreciated your analysis of the 23 budget and issues for parliamentarians. You wrote that you recommend, I'll continue where Mr. Moran had left off. You are recommending that we adopt a new legislative or administrative framework to increase transparency and comprehension for the public and parliamentarians. So you're suggesting that the budget be tabled at a fixed date that might guarantee better harmonization between various government financial reports. Could you re-explain your recommendation about that? Thank you. With pleasure, Mr. Sainte-Marie. So the recommendation I made, and I discussed it many times since I was accepted my position, the government tables the main estimates, the way the government is financing itself, the bill that is approved by Parliament has to be done before March 1st. So it is tabled before March 1st, but it often precedes the budget. So parliamentarians like you have to vote on the funding of the government operations, but the government tables its budget after you have that piece of legislation, which means that in the supplementary estimates, you don't see all government spending. That has to be corrected with a supplementary budget. So you're asked to vote on government spending for the coming year before you know what the government's priorities are. So one way to simplify all this would be to make sure that the budget is tabled in February, for example, at a date or a certain window that is predetermined. That would allow you to have the budget and then the legislation that includes government spending, government operation spending, and budget initiatives. So you would have a more accurate picture of operations and government spending, the funds that the government needs to operate and deliver the goods on the budgetary promises. So that would be a more logical sequence. Have the budget and then the bill that requests the funds to deliver the goods on that budget. Okay, thank you. Let's hope that the government will go ahead with that. We'll try to remind it of that as often as possible. We have the parliamentary secretary with us today. I hope he's noting this. In the budget analysis, one of the problems I see, and it shows in your analysis, is the issue of transparency, but the angle I'd choose is a comparison. Back when Paul Martin was finance minister, at every budget, my predecessor, the finance critic in the bloc, found the government's trick. It systematically overestimated its spending. It would arrive with a balance or a slight deficit, and then at the end of the year, it would have great news and say, oh, the situation is better than what we thought. So I'd like to hear your opinion about the government's forecasts for growth of spending. In addition, in the last data I was able to find in public accounts, the government left on the table 41 billion votes that weren't voted on. The last year available is 2022. When I asked officials from finance to tell me where this was in the budget, they said, we can't answer you. It's not systematically found in there. So I'd like to hear your views on all that. Thank you. Thank you. That's a lot of things to discuss, but on the issue of expired votes, of course, given its structure and the constraints that are imposed on the department, which mean that they cannot spend more than what Parliament has authorized, it means that managers throughout the government will be cautious. They will ask for a little more money than what they need in order to avoid bad surprises, or they'll go to the limit of what they can spend in order to face unpredictable issues. They can't overspend their budget according to law. So there's always money left over every year. What's provided for in the budget framework is when they establish their spending, there's always a factor of expired money that's included to reflect the fact that that happens year over year. When there's an injection of funds ad hoc, as was the case for COVID, for instance, that increases because it's harder then for the government to accurately predict how much they will spend exactly. So the other aspect of your question was about spending forecasts and the fact that in the past there were reserves, prudence factors where they overestimated spending in order to have results that were better than anticipated. That gave rise to the creation of the parliamentary budget officer. That was the frustrations felt by the parliamentarians at the time. The government underestimated its surplus. It prevented parliamentarians to have enlightened debates and an accurate picture of public finances. So that was a concern. It's less so now since the PBO was created. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sainte-Marie.
Going to the NDP, MP Blakey, and you'll be our final questioner.
Thank you very
Monsieur
much.
Giroux.
I think for Canadians that get the lion's share of their knowledge about federal government policy from question period might be thinking that the carbon tax is a large source of net revenue for the government. I'm just wondering, what is the net revenue to the federal government from the carbon tax?
Well, the carbon tax has been designed such as the vast majority of the proceeds is returned to individuals and households. So the net revenue for the government should be negligible, especially when considering the admin costs. So the net proceeds for the government of the carbon tax is not exactly zero, but close to zero.
Okay, but it's not a real revenue source. It wouldn't appear in a budget table or anything like that.
Well, for government operations of over $400 billion, it is negligible once taken into account the proceeds returned to individuals.
Okay.
As we have said in many reports.
Okay. So the money that's collected gets returned to Canadian individuals. Does any of it get returned to Canadian businesses?
To my knowledge, it doesn't. There might be some very specific aspects, but the bulk of the proceeds gets returned to individuals, to households.
Okay. And we've heard a lot of controversy around the question of whether Canadian households receive more back from the tax that they pay than they pay the tax. But what I'm hearing is that actually the entire amount that individuals pay that's designated as a carbon tax, and then the entire amount that businesses pay that's designated as a carbon tax is returned to Canadian individuals. Is there a household income level under which we could say with confidence people are receiving more than they're paying, or a break-even point?
So that's a question to which the answer varies by province, because it depends on consumption patterns, on how the electricity that households consume, how it's generated. Is it generated from fossil fuels or not? But generally speaking, if we look only at the carbon tax that households pay and the rebate that they get, the majority, I'd say about 80%, get more in rebates than what they pay. The top quintile, so the top 20% of household in terms of income, generally pay more than what they get in rebates if we only look at the carbon tax they pay versus what they receive. But it varies, of course, depending on individual consumption patterns. If you drive a big VR and you heat your home with oil or natural gas, you will obviously pay more than you receive in carbon taxes. The controversy has arisen because of the inclusion of the economic impacts of a carbon tax. It's true that any tax has implications and generates some friction in the economy, and the carbon tax is no different. So introducing a carbon tax has impacts on specific sectors, and the more fossil fuel intensive these sectors are, the more impacts are likely to be felt on these sectors. So when including the economic impacts, we find that most households will see a small loss, depending on the magnitude varies, but a loss in taking into account the loss of economic output, investment income, employment income, and the difference between what they pay and the rebate they receive. So it's taking into account all the impacts of a carbon tax.
And
on the economy.
is that a forecasting as well?
Yes.
Okay. And so does that forecasting include likely emission reductions from investments that government and people in the private sector are making in order to reduce their emissions already? Or is that not part of the assumption base that generates those forecasts?
So that includes the behavioral change that will be induced by the carbon tax and its increase, but it does not include the so-called benefits of carbon emissions reductions, because these are very difficult. It's very difficult to quantify in dollar terms the benefits of a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. If there was a way to quantify these benefits between now and 2030 of reducing carbon emissions, we'd be happy to consider and include them. But the dollar benefits of transitioning to a greener economy between now and 2030 are very, very difficult to assess.
Okay. So in the economic analysis that says Canadians are breaking even or suffering a small loss, there's a lot of assumptions that have to be made about behavioral change. And there hasn't been an attempt, because there's too much uncertainty and there isn't an adequate model to measure the financial benefit of emissions reductions. But on what we can measure very clearly, which is money paid under the auspices of the carbon tax and the money that's refunded to individuals, 80% of Canadians are breaking even or receiving more back than they pay in the carbon tax. And of the 20% that are likely to be paying more in tax than they're receiving back, they're likely to be in the top quintile of Canadian earners. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement, and that's a fair depiction of the results of our multiple reports on that issue over the last few years.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the clarity, because I think it's become quite muddled in parliamentary debate recently.
Thank you, MP Blakey, and we want to thank the Office of the PBO and, of course, the PBO, Monsieur Giroux, for being with us, for your testimony on this report, this study, and thank you very much. We really appreciate your time. Thank you. And members, now we're going to suspend for 5 minutes as we get ready for our second panel. Great, we'll just leave the cameras. Yeah, okay, you just want, wait till the governor sits down, want to get a good picture of you. Okay, I think we're good to go. Okay, so yeah, members, we're back for our second panel, and with us today from the Bank of Canada, we have the Governor, Tiff Macklem, and the Senior Deputy Governor, Carolyn Rogers. And so now the floor is yours to open up for some opening remarks and then to members' questions.
Well, thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. We're very pleased to be here, Senior Deputy Governor and I, to discuss our recent policy announcement last week and our monetary policy report. Last week, we maintained the policy rate at 4.5%, and we continue to assess whether monetary policy is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to the 2% inflation target. Since the last time we were here, we've seen a steady improvement in inflation and modest economic growth. Inflation's coming down quickly, and the data this morning inflation for March came in at 4.3%. And we forecast inflation will be around 3% this summer. We are encouraged by that, but we are also seized with the importance of staying the course and restoring price stability for Canadians. Several things have to happen to get inflation all the way back to the 2% target. Inflation expectations need to come down further, service price inflation and wage growth need to moderate, and corporate pricing behavior has to normalize. We're focused on these indicators and the evolution of core inflation to ensure that CPI inflation continues to progress towards our target. If monetary policy is not restrictive enough to get us all the way back to the 2% target, we are prepared to raise interest rates further. Before I take your questions, let me give you some economic and financial context for our decision. Au Canada, la demande reste excédentaire.
In Canada, the increase in the GDP seems above our January projections. The labor market remains tense. At 5%, the unemployment rate is at its all-time low, and salaries continue to rise within 4 to 5%. Job growth was stronger than anticipated. That reflects the fact that demand and increases in the supply of labor is maintained.
And restraining demand. Households are slowing their spending, particularly on big-ticket items. As mortgages are renewed at higher rates, more households will feel the restraining effects of monetary policy. Taking these forces into consideration, we expect Canadian GDP growth to be weak for the rest of the year before beginning to pick up gradually through 2024 and 2025. So what does all this mean for inflation? We've come a long way from 8% inflation that we saw last summer. And as I mentioned, annual CPI inflation was down to 4.3% in March, led by falling goods price inflation, and we see further declines ahead. That's good news. But many Canadians are still struggling to manage the rising cost of living, and the prices for many things people need to buy are still rising too quickly. Food price inflation is just under 10%. We expect food price inflation to come down in the months ahead, but service price inflation will take longer. Continued strong demand and a tight labor market are putting upward pressure on many services prices, and those are expected to decline only gradually. We expect it will take until the end of 2024 to get inflation all the way back to our 2% target. When the Governing Council met last week, we discussed whether we've raised rates enough, and we considered the likelihood that the policy rate may need to remain restrictive for longer to return inflation to the 2% target. Le Conseil de Direction.
Governing Council also discussed the risks around our projection. The biggest upside risk is one I just mentioned, that service price inflation could be stickier than projected. The key downside risk is a global recession. If global banking stress reemerges, we could be facing a more severe global slowdown and much lower commodity prices. Overall, we view the risks around our inflation forecast to be roughly balanced, but with inflation still well above our target, we continue to be more concerned about the upside risks.
Let me conclude. Our job at the Bank of Canada is to get inflation all the way back to the 2% target. We are encouraged by the progress so far. And when we see inflation around 3% this summer, that's going to be further welcome relief for Canadians. But let me assure Canadians that we know our job is not done until we restore price stability. Price stability is important because it restores the competitive forces in the economy and allows Canadians to plan and invest with confidence that their money will hold its value. That's the destination. We're on our way, and we will stay the course. And with that summary, the Senior Deputy Governor and I will be very pleased to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Macklem and Senior Deputy Governor Rogers. And now we're off to our questions. Our first round, we have the Conservatives, MP Hullen, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to Governor Macklem and Deputy Governor Rogers for being here today at FINA once again. The Parliamentary Budget Officer projects the new gross spending for Budget 2023 will be $6.7 billion higher than projected in Budget 2023 at $69.7 billion. And there's no doubt there will be more government spending given the track record of this Liberal government. Does this increased level in spending work against your efforts to address inflation?
Important question. Well, the first thing I want to say, and I can't stress this enough, fiscal plans are the responsibility of elected governments, ultimately parliamentarians. Governments have many priorities. They've got difficult decisions to take.
No doubt we've heard that many times, but
it's important to repeat it, though. It's important that we have a mandate, and I'm just getting to that. Our job is to control inflation, and we are happy to comment on what the aggregate impact of government spending is on economic growth and on inflation. So, in the forecast that we presented last week in our monetary policy report, it does include the new fiscal projections of the federal government, the provincial governments that were in their budget, their recent budgets. And on a national accounts basis, those budgets altogether add about $25 billion of additional fiscal measures over the next 3 years. About 3/4 of that, those additional measures are provincial measures. About the other quarter, roughly, is federal. And you can see the impact of those additional fiscal measures. They show up in our forecast. You can see it in Table 2. You can see the contribution from government spending to growth is increased. And government spending in over this year is running sort of 2.5% growth. So how is that affecting inflation? So one way to look at how government spending is affecting inflation is to compare the rate of growth of government spending relative to the rate of growth of the potential output, the trend growth in the economy. So we think that trend growth is about 2, and if government spending was growing well above that, that would be boosting demand further and putting additional pressures on inflation. Government spending in our projection based on those budgets is growing at about 2 to 2.5%. So it's broadly in line with potential output. So the way that I would put it is that the government spending plans are not contributing to the slowing of the economy. They're not contributing to the easing of inflationary pressures, but they're not standing in the way of getting inflation back to our target. And as I mentioned, in our inflation, which incorporates those budget projections, we have inflation coming back to target.
Okay, so but
by the end of 2024.
In Budget 2023, the growth in spending was 4.1%. And previously, in your own undertaking, at your last appearance, you said that the bank had priced in 1.4%. That's 4 times higher than what was projected in your last committee appearance. Does that mean your projections were underestimated? And you underestimated the impacts of the government spending in your last time you were here?
The numbers I have, so the second half of last year, government spending was growing at about 3.5%, and we did indicate that if that rate was sustained, that would boost demand and could make it more difficult to get inflation back. Our forecast for this year is the next couple of years is about 2.5%, and as I said, that's broadly in line with potential output. That is an upward revision from what we had in our forecast in January, because it does incorporate the new spending, the new fiscal measures in the latest budgets.
So are you anticipating higher pressures then? Are you forecasting that there's going to be larger than usual deficits that will outpace potential GDP?
Well, we don't really forecast the deficits. We take the government's own fiscal plans as given. The governments have forecasted their deficits. As I indicated, the way I would put it is government spending is growing broadly in line with the trend growth in the economy. So it's not boosting, it's not overheating the economy, but it's continuing to contribute to growth. So it's not putting downward pressure on inflation either.
So given that, are you forecasting entrenched inflation then? Is that the way you guys are forecasting?
No, we are not forecasting entrenched inflation. And as you can see, inflation is actually coming down quite quickly.
But right now, there's
last
a
summer it
positive
was 8,
output
it was
gap.
4.3 today. We're expecting it to be about 3 this summer, 2.5 by the end of the year, and 2% by the end of 2024. I mean, I will say a couple of things on government's spending plans. Governments at different levels are spending to protect.
I got to move on.
Okay.
So I just want to know, are you comfortable with the spending being above with the 1.4% that you forecasted for? Is that something you're
It's not
comfortable
really
with?
my job to be comfortable with spending. I'm comfortable with our inflation forecast. It's really up to Parliament to decide on the comfort on spending. And
Okay, so
we've
I'll
incorporated it into our forecast, and we have inflation coming back
Fair.
to 2%.
I got to move on. I only have a little bit of time. The government expanded the size of the public service by 30%. This on top of spending $21.4 billion just on consultants. Labor market remains tight, like you said. Labor shortages are causing the cost to hire workers go up. Would you agree that the public service expansion is making the tightening of the labor market worse?
Look, we look at the labor market overall. The labor market is tight. It is. We are seeing some
we're also
signs
paying
of
for more
easing.
public services and consultants.
We're at
I don't
time,
really-
actually, gentlemen, and so thank you, MP Hallen. There'll be more rounds. Now we're going to the Liberals. MP Zarowitz for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you much, Mr. Chair. And I want to say a huge thanks to you, Governor Macklem, and Senior Deputy Governor Rogers for being with us once again today and for your extraordinary work on behalf of our nation. My first question to you is about jobs, increased wages, and impact on inflation. In one of my previous questions to you, Governor, I had said to you, is it always bad is there always going to be a negative impact on inflation if wages increase? And I recall that your response back to me was, it's okay if wages go up as long as there's a corresponding increase in productivity. And so for me, when I'm thinking about wages, it's hard because you kind of think of it in a big bucket, and there's many people that are paid very well. There's some people that are paid what they're worth. And there's a huge grouping of people, I believe, in our society that needs to be paid more. So whether it's nurses or personal support workers or some key sections of our hospitality industry. And I guess my question to you is, because I don't want to discourage those that need to see their wages go up from going up. So maybe if you can maybe comment a little bit on that. And I'm not sure if you're able to comment about what productivity increase might look like in sectors where you need to see wages go up. So things, again, like nurses or personal support workers or some key parts of the hospitality industry. So if you can maybe comment on that.
Yes. So, yes, as you referred to, higher productivity pays for higher wages, and a growing economy with rising productivity supports wage growth that isn't contributing to inflation. Right now, wage growth is running at about 4 to 5%. And productivity growth is actually declining. So if we want to get inflation back to target, we are going to need to see some overall moderation in wage growth for the economy as a whole. That doesn't mean wages can't grow faster in some sectors and slower in some other sectors. That will reflect demand conditions in those sectors. It'll also reflect productivity growth in those sectors. But if we want to sustain higher wage growth over time, we do need to improve our productivity growth in this country.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. My next question, in your opening statement at the Monetary Policy Report press conference, you indicated the following: the bank's business outlook survey says that it's becoming easier to find the workers they need, which suggests that the tightness in the labor market is beginning to ease. Do you have any more data on that? Just because there's a mix between people who are saying that there's lots of jobs out there, and then there's those that are saying that they still need to be filling. They haven't been able to fill positions. So this is the first time I'm seeing a positive that employers are able to fill the jobs. So is it that it's moved from 50% employers before were saying that they needed workers, and now it's gone down to 25%? Are you able to put some numbers around that?
I don't have all the numbers from the Business Outlook survey in front of me, but keep in mind it is a survey of about 100 companies, so you don't want to take, you want to look more at the direction, I would say, than be very precise about the various numbers. I can say a couple of things. So if you look at the sort of big macro numbers, like the unemployment rate or the rate of employment growth, unemployment rate has stayed at 5%. It really hasn't budged. And certainly looking at the unemployment rate alone, as well as employment growth, labor market remains very tight. When you talk to businesses, what you hear is that they are starting to find it easier to fill positions. They're having more success hiring people. They say labor is more available. There's less competition from other companies for the same workers. So they're starting to find it easier to fill those jobs. The other thing I would mention in this context is that we have seen a big increase in immigration, and companies have also been using the temporary foreign worker program more. So that has brought a lot of additional workers into the country, and that may be one of the reasons why you're seeing some easing in the tightness in the labor market.
Given that in January there were strong GDP numbers, there continues to be continued resilience in the labor market and a continued decline in inflation as evidenced by this morning's release. Do you see a possibility for a soft landing scenario in Canada?
Well, our own forecast is these terms are a little bit vague, but I think most people would call our own forecast a soft landing. Growth in the first quarter actually looks a little bit stronger than we previously thought. And then for the remaining 3 quarters of this year, we expect growth to be small positive, so less than 1%, but above 0. So growth's going to be weak. It's not going to feel good. But it is going to be slightly positive growth, which I think most people would call a soft landing. There are, of course, risks around that. And as we highlighted in the report, the biggest risk is a global recession, and we are a very open economy, very integrated with the world. And if that were to happen, growth would be weaker in Canada.
Thank you. And
thank you so much.
Thank you, MP Zerowitz. And now to the block, and MP Sainte-Marie, please, for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor McClem, Ms. Rogers, thank you for your presence here today. In your report on monetary policy, I was surprised to see that you're anticipating growth in the GDP, and I do want to confirm this is real growth, 1.4% this year, 1.3% for 2024. So why is the anticipated growth lower for 2024 than 2023? Well, yes. That's the mathematics of growth rate year after year compared to quarterly growth that's annualized. So if you look at growth on a quarterly basis, annualized, it's very weak for the rest of this calendar year. It starts to increase next year, and it's even stronger in 2025. But when you calculate the average for the year, and those are the figures you just cited, that's a yearly average, it's about the same thing for both years. But if you look at the quarterly dynamic, it's stronger in 2024. Okay, thank you. That enlightens me. How are your forecasts for the various factors in the economy different from those presented in the 2023 budget? The federal budget? There's not a big difference. I think that the survey used by the federal government, the Department of Finance, was done before we did our forecasts, so we had more recent data. For the first quarter, the figures are a little higher in our forecasts. It's a little stronger, but the two forecasts are for weak growth and a reduction in growth. The forecasts in the budget are still a little weaker than ours, but both are weak. Okay, thank you. Interest rates, as you've reminded us, have been raised. The prime rate has been raised. When it comes to the banks, do you feel that this increase in rates is reflected in the interest by savers? Are the rates offered by the banks to savers a good reflection of the rate, the bank rate? Is the competition factor working well between the banks? Are we in a situation of an oligopoly or something like it? Well, two questions there. In answer to your first question, yes. When we increased our rate, our prime rate, this was transmitted to the decision makers in the banks. Rates for loans are higher, for mortgages are higher. And now there's more competition for deposits. Rates for deposits are increasing too. So yes. On every cycle, there's always some delay. Some things go faster than others. But on the whole, yes, that's transmitted. In our banking system, we have a system with a few major national banks. We all know them well. And we also have a system of small and medium-sized banks that are more regional. And they provide some competition to the major banks, but on the whole, I think that Canada has struck a good balance in its banking system. It has a reputation for being very stable, and that's good for all Canadians. I think that's reflected in our national bank system. It's well diversified. They manage their risk very carefully. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have left?
Marie?
Oui, donc je vais.
My next questions require long answers, so I'll wait for my next turn. Thank you.
And there will be a next turn. So off to the NDP and MP Blakey, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. Back in the fall of 2021, there was some fanfare around a new mandate-ish for the Bank of Canada. But it seems to me that the bank still has a pretty hard-nosed focus on price stability or inflation control. And we've heard you say on many occasions that the unemployment rate is low, that expectations around wage growth are a factor in your deliberations around where to keep the general rate. I'm wondering, from that new mandate in the fall of 2021, has that changed any of the assumptions that the bank works with? Has it changed its approach? Is its analysis substantially different in any way? given the new agreement that was signed in the fall of 2021? And if so, in what ways would you say that new mandate has changed the way you've approached the scenario that we found ourselves in over the last 2 years versus if you had used the mandate that had been signed off on in or around 2016?
So two things. First of all, what's changed or what hasn't changed? I think what hasn't changed is since 1995, the inflation target has been 2%. I think what the agreement in December of 2021 did do is it was clearer about the role of the labor market in the formation of monetary policy. And it was clear that our primary objective is monetary policy, and our primary objective is low, stable inflation. And in pursuing that, we do look at the labor market carefully, and we do want to support strong levels of employment. I think so. Really, I would say that the agreement in December of 2021, it really was not a big change. It was more continuity. I think it did add some clarity. With respect to what has changed, and this really has been very important through the whole pandemic period, is we have been putting more emphasis on the labor market. And you asked, what can you see that's changed? I think what you can see that's changed is we are putting out much more analysis of the labor market. We are looking at the labor market at a much more disaggregated level. We're not just looking at the big aggregate statistics like the unemployment rate and the amount of employment. We're looking at it by different demographic groups, age, gender, high-income workers, low-income workers. And that is, I think, helping us get a better picture of, you talked about how does it affect us right now. Right now we're looking at how higher interest rates are working their way through the economy to bring inflation down. And by looking at the labor market at a more granular level, that's one way that we can get a better picture of that, which should lead to better decisions.
So in the fall of 2021, Pierre Poilievre at that time was the finance critic, and he was very concerned that the Bank of Canada's principal policy focus remain price stability and inflation control. In that sense, the government pretty much did what Mr. Poilievre was recommending at that time. Is that fair to say?
Price stability remains absolutely central. That is our primary objective.
One of the questions that I have for you is when you're looking at that unemployment rate, and we've heard you express concern that remains low. Is there a target unemployment rate, and is there a scenario where unemployment continues to be low, where you foresee the bank nevertheless lowering interest rates, or is it important to the bank that unemployment reach a level it's not currently at in order to trigger a reduction in the general rate? So
we're guided really by inflation and achieving our inflation mandate, and it is important that when you're targeting inflation, because there are lags in the effects of monetary policy, you need to look forward, not to only as to where inflation is, but also where you think it's going. And that's where the labor market becomes particularly important. So, so far, we've actually, inflation has come down from 8% last summer to 4.3% today. The labor market has remained very strong. Our own forecast is that growth is going to be weak through the rest of this year. And, to be frank, we need weak growth. We've still got demand running ahead of supply in the economy. We've still got a lot of upward pressure on services prices. If we're going to get inflation back to 2, we need to relieve those pressures. So we actually need this period of slower growth to let supply catch up.
Would you say weak growth implies higher unemployment?
Yeah, that's just where I was just getting to. Yeah. So we don't publish a forecast of unemployment, but it probably means that the unemployment rate will need to move up. We're not talking about large increases in unemployment. To get back to one of the early questions, it's a soft we've got positive
if I may,
growth.
and I am sorry to interrupt, but before my time runs out, I want to explore one consequence of that. So, without effective automatic stabilizers like a well-functioning employment insurance system, if we're going to see the rate of unemployment likely go up, and if that's a direct or indirect policy goal of the bank, like how important is it to have effective automatic stabilizers, both from a macro point of view in respect to the economy, and then also for individual Canadian households that they have some kind of income replacement in the face of unemployment?
Yeah.
In a very short answer.
Well,
Governor.
just to be clear, we take no pleasure in increasing the unemployment rate. We have difficult decisions to take. There is real value in restoring price stability, and I'm going to leave issues of fiscal policy to
Thank you.
government and parliamentarians.
And thank you, MP Blakey. And now to our second round, and we're starting with MP Chambers for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Deputy Governor. It's always a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for accepting our invitation, although I know you often come under your own volition. You've come here at least a half a dozen times, probably in a couple of years. Unfortunately, the executive branch and the Minister of Finance has not accepted our invitation, so we greatly appreciate your willingness to be transparent with parliamentarians. I wanted to talk a little bit about real estate, if I may, and I don't know if that's Ms. Rogers' portfolio, but was the bank consulted on the government and OSFI's decision to allow lenders to extend amortization periods on refinance?
Those are decisions that individual lenders make. I think the extension of amortization periods are as long as they're within their existing risk policies. I know OSFI pays close attention to these things, but I don't think these are policies that are sort of outside their normal product line. So
Okay.
I don't think there was a change to consult on, I guess, to be very direct about your question.
Yes. Does it concern you that some lenders have 20 to 25% of their mortgage portfolios with amortizations that are well beyond 40 years now?
We actually met with some banks last week. We asked the specific question, something we keep an eye on for sure. What they told us is these are borrowers that they're working with. It depends very much on the borrower's situation, what the options available are. Some of them are refinancing, some of them are paying down their mortgage, some of them are looking at payment adjustments. So I think the banks are acutely aware that mortgages that are not getting paid down, they're not amortizing down, is not a sustainable situation over the long term. But as we understand it, they're working closely with these borrowers. This is something that, we've provided analysis on this. There's a little bit of analysis in box 3 in the NPR. We've got our financial systems report that we'll deliver in May, and you'll see us provide a bit more analysis on the mortgage market there.
Oh, thank you. We look forward to that. I mean, you have a job to do. So does OSFI, so does the other bodies in the regulatory system. But when decisions are made, it impacts other parts of the system. For example, we know the positive trade-offs with a decision like that, but there are also negative trade-offs with a decision like that, including not allowing demand to come down in certain circumstances, or putting a price level under housing. And we have a lot of people who are not in the housing market right now, especially young people, who are saying, the system is completely rigged against me. There was low interest rates for over a decade, and people kind of gorged on debt and supported an incredible supercharging of the real estate sector and investment in the real estate sector. Canada has, in terms of percentage of GDP, one of the highest amounts of GDP as investment in residential real estate. And now, when the system should be correcting, right, prices could come down, the system is keeping prices a little higher. The real estate market's actually now, just recently, in a couple months, gone back up in value in certain markets because there's nobody listing a house. And so there's lots of pressures on that system, and there's positive and negative trade-offs. So, we appreciate the bank's view on this, and we'll look forward to some of that future, the work that you do. In my last minute, just like to switch to productivity because it was brought up. We measure standard of living by GDP per capita, but that measure is quite poor in Canada. We're really just doing growth by volume, which is the pie is growing, but everybody's slice of the pie is remaining the same. One of the pressures on house prices and demand, I think you even note in the report, is well over the long term, we increase supply potential with population growth. In the short term, does it not create challenges as a headwind for demand in general goods and services and for real estate?
Yeah, I mean, immigration, as with many policies, has effects on both supply and demand. I think we note that in the monetary policy report. Immigration will increase the labor supply, and that's a good thing. It'll help relieve the tightness in the labor market. It also helps increase potential over the long term. But it is also the case that immigration, immigrants buy houses, as you note, they add to demand. So in an economy that's already in excess demand, adding immigration will add to both sides. So it doesn't necessarily relieve the excess demand. It will add both supply and demand pressure.
And thank you, MP Chambers. Now over to MP MacDonald for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Governor, I think I asked you about the provinces in relation to the economic growth and their contribution to inflation each and every time you come in here. So I'm not gonna break my trend. Could you comment on the fiscal positions of the provinces and territories relative to the federal government at the present time?
Well, I want to go back to the very first thing I said. It's really, fiscal decisions are the decisions of governments of parliament, and we're going to leave it to them. I mean, what I can say, as I did in my response to the first question, we take federal and provincial governments as given, their spending plans as given, and we put those in our projections, and we work out what the implications are for real growth, for inflation, and ultimately what we need to do with interest rates to get inflation back to target. So there have been a host of provincial budgets, federal budget. We took those, we put those into our projection, and they added about $25 billion of additional spending over the next 3 years. About 3/4 of that was coming from the provincial budgets and about 1/4 from the federal budget.
So the $25 billion, or the quarter of that coming from the provincial governments, is that standard from year to year? Or is
that will vary from year to year. During the pandemic, for example, the provincial and federal government was expanding their spending considerably to support the economy when it was in a very dire situation. The federal was bigger than the provincial through that period. So it will vary.
98 cents per dollar, basically, is in my home province. Do you currently foresee any challenges or disruptions on the horizon that may disrupt or trend downwards inflation that we've seen in recent months?
There are some risks, and I think we highlighted them in our report. As I mentioned in my opening statement, we expect inflation. It's coming down pretty quickly, and most of that decline is coming from goods prices. So there have been big declines in energy prices. Global supply chains have improved, and we're also seeing the effects of monetary policy on interest-sensitive items, things that people usually buy on credit, things like furniture or appliances, houses, obviously, that we were just talking about. But what is taking longer is service price inflation. And part of that is to be expected. Services were the sort of the last part to recover, and people are still trying to catch up on some of those services they missed during the pandemic, and monetary policy takes longer to work on services. But we're not going to get inflation down to 2% if we don't get service price inflation down. And coming back to your question, labor input costs are a big part of providing services. We need wage growth to moderate. We need service price inflation to come down. And the other thing we're really watching closely is the behavior of companies. So when inflation was really high, what we saw was that companies were increasing their prices much more frequently and by much more. And what we've started to see is that that is beginning to normalize. Those price increases are less frequent and not as much, but they're not normal yet. And when you talk to companies, what you hear is, yeah, we've still got some cost pressures and we're passing those on. That's because the economy is in excess demand. It's, when companies are not worried about losing customers, they just pass on those prices. So when we get it's starting to normalize, but that's something that we need to watch closely. So we're moving in the right direction, but we're not there yet, and there's some more things we have to see before we're going to get there.
Thank you. And so our activity data is up. We're trending downward for the past 9 months. We've created 200,000 jobs in 3 months. We're seeing wage growth. We have the second lowest inflation rate in the G7 now, next to Japan. Just quickly, and we don't have much time, but just can you briefly describe the resiliency of our economy?
Well, you mentioned international comparisons. Look, this has been a very difficult couple of years for Canadians, and Canadians are still feeling the effects of inflation. But if you do compare Canada against other similar countries, our sort of country peers, we do look pretty good. And growth in Canada has been among the strongest. And inflation, while it's certainly too high, it's other than Japan, it's the lowest in the G7. So that doesn't really help Canadians feel any better. But I think if you compare us to other countries, yes, Canada has been doing reasonably well.
Thank you, and thank you, MP MacDonald. And now to MP Sainte-Marie, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci.
Thank you. An economist, William H. Buiter, who was at Citibank and at the Committee of the Bank of England, has suggested that central banks abandon paper currency and have fully digital or virtual currency. His argument for that is based on world economy predictions by the IMF. He says that it's plausible that we'll get back to a low-interest monetary policy, and to make sure that central banks have better tools, we could have a negative interest rates, which is difficult with paper currency, which is not the case with virtual or digital currency. I don't necessarily share his view, but I'd like to hear your view about this possibility. Where are you at in evaluating that possibility? Well, the brief answer is we're very far from Mr. Buiter's world. We will have paper currency for a long time. Canadians like their paper bills. It's very important for daily life. There's an important question. It might be a good idea to give Canadians access to digital money from the central bank. We're looking at this issue closely. There are various aspects to our research. The question is, what would be the benefit of this? What would be the impact of digital currency by the central bank on our financial system? There's also technical issues. If we do something like that, it's very important that it work very well. Very high security, widespread access for Canadians. Those are the kinds of questions we're looking at right now. But it's still an R&D project. It's not a decision. No decision has been made to this point. And I want to underscore that if ever we do have digital currency at the central bank, that would be a decision for the Canadian government. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Saint-Marie.
2.5 minutes.
Thank you. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the housing market. I mean, we've seen in Canada for decades now, that as interest rates declined, as they did for a long time from the mid-90s until recently, people whose real wages weren't growing were nevertheless able to bid more to buy a home as interest rates declined. They were able to leverage more out of their earnings, and house prices steadily increased. We saw a real explosion during the pandemic, partly because people weren't spending money on other things, so they had more money to spend on a home. They also there was elevated demand because you had people who were now going to be spending a lot more time in their home. They wanted more space. They wanted different kinds of space. Virtual work made new areas to live in possible while keeping the same job. And frankly, there were a lot of couples that broke up during the pandemic too, and that creates a certain kind of housing demand, as well as families now require 2 homes instead of 1. But nevertheless, there was a trajectory, pretty steady and pretty quick, of price increases within the housing market. Now, we haven't done anything and then institutional investors moving into the residential housing space as well in a number of different ways, both for single-family dwellings, but then also for larger apartment blocks and things like that. Now, we haven't done anything to address investment activity in the residential sector, so I'm wondering what the bank's opinion is. If rates do start to come down sometime in the next 12 months, as inflation returns to target range. I think you said by the end of 2024, but we might see 3% sometime in the relatively near future. Doesn't that just mean that the pattern resumes, that lower interest rates mean that Canadians are now able to bid higher on the price of homes? And they'll certainly be encouraged to do that by real estate agents and other actors in that space. What does it mean for the housing crisis to have rates go down again?
So, I mean, as you said, there's been a number of things affecting the dynamics in the housing market. Interest rates are one, low interest rates are one. Most people who buy a home buy on credit. So when interest rates are low, you can buy more house. And there was the surge during the pandemic, and as you point out, there were some shifts in demand, the types of housing people were looking for. And in my previous question with MP Chambers, the effect of immigration on housing, for sure. But the one thing that has been constant throughout is there is not enough supply of housing, and it's really a fundamental law of economics, is if there's more demand for something than there is supply, there's going to be pressure on prices. So we do need, over the long term, to deal with housing supply. That'll be one of the most important things to relieve pressures, and it is encouraging to see different levels of government pursuing a variety of programs to deal with supply. But that is something the bank has pointed out for quite a long time now.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Blakey. And now to the Conservatives, MP Morantz, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Governor, I happened to catch an interview with Derek Holt on the weekend on CTV, and he said something interesting that I hadn't heard an economist say before. So I'll just read it to you. It says, government spending is heavily going towards inflation. We've increased annual federal government spending by $105 billion per year compared to what was the case in the fiscal year just before the pandemic struck. And that's going up to $170 billion per year, more than 5 years out from now, than what the government were spending before the pandemic. And we know that's contributing to inflation. And then he says, it probably accounts for at least a percentage point worth of the Bank of Canada's rate hike, probably more than that. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, our own analysis, no, I don't agree with that entire statement. Look, government spending is contributing to growth. There's no question about that. It's running roughly in line with potential growth of the economy, 2.5%, potentials 2%, so slightly on the high side of that. But roughly, to the extent that we can measure these things well, roughly in line with potential. And in that sense, it's not contributing to the slowdown in growth that we're seeing. It's not relieving inflationary
you made that
pressures,
argument earlier,
but
so
it's not preventing inflation from
and
coming
Governor,
down.
I was going to ask you about that argument next, but you made it earlier, so pardon me for interrupting. My time is limited. Essentially, what you're saying now is that, government spending isn't making the problem any worse right now, but it's not making it any better. Now, it seems to me that fiscal and monetary policy should work together. In our last discussion, you said that you felt or had assurances that the government wasn't planning on working at cross purposes with you. Now we have credible economists like Mr. Holt saying that that government spending has directly contributed to high interest rates. Now, you said that, inflation is coming down. It's not job done, I think you said in your statement. It's not job done. And that interest rates could go up even higher. So I ask you again, and you keep saying fiscal policy isn't your responsibility, but it affects your job. You must have an opinion on it.
It affects our job.
Does the government spending have an effect on interest rates?
Yeah. It affects our job,
Does it
and we
affect
take it
interest
into
rates?
account, and we do our job. A couple of things I can say, sort of, I think, looking ahead. So, in terms of what is on our mind, a number of governments across the country have taken various measures to protect Canadians from the effects of high inflation. And on that front, I think the advice of the IMF is quite sensible, that those programs should be targeted and temporary. So what do I mean by targeted? Targeted on the most vulnerable people. Those are the people that are being most affected by inflation. And temporary because, as we've said, inflation's coming down. When inflation comes down, we won't need those anymore. So I would sign on to that bit of advice.
I'm just trying to get at one thing. Really what I'm interested in knowing is, has government spending, which has been established as being inflationary, impacted the bank's interest rate? Is it higher than it would have been if not for profligate government spending? That should be a fairly straightforward question for an economist to answer.
Okay, look, it's economics 100 that if consumption was stronger, if government spending was stronger, if investment was stronger, if net exports were stronger, there'd be more growth in the economy, there'd be more inflationary pressures, and there'd be more inflation. And interest rates would need to be higher to bring it down. And you can say all those things in reverse. So, yes, government spending feeds into our projection, and I've outlined how it's fed in, and I've outlined, what we think on net the effect is. I will say in closing that, with government spending running broadly in line with the potential output, it is going to be important, if government spending starts to increases further and it runs well ahead of potential output, then it would start to get in, it would be actually boosting the economy above its trend growth, and that would make it harder to get inflation down. And that would be a problem.
I think
One last question.
Just a few seconds left. Just a different topic. It has to do with the amount of daylight between the American overnight rate and the Canadian overnight rate. And I know you said inflation is coming down. You reserve the right to increase interest rates, of course. But if there's too much space between the Canadian rate and the American rate, that can become inflationary in and of itself. It would affect the exchange rate between Canada and the U.S. How do you deal with that? Are you concerned that you could be forced into a situation where you have to increase interest rates further just because the Americans are?
Short answer, please.
Sorry.
In a short answer, please.
Short answer.
Yeah,
Okay.
yes.
I'll do my best.
Say yes.
I mean, the first thing is, look, the advantage of having our own monetary policy in Canada is we can gear monetary policy in Canada to what's going on in Canada. And the flexible exchange rate is the thing that allows us to have our own monetary policy geared for the situation in Canada. Inflation in Canada is a little lower than the United States. We've not had to raise rates as high as they have. Yes, that does have some implications for the exchange rate. The market, I think, has digested that rate differential quite well. I think the market's expecting a rate differential going forward, and so to a large extent, that's already built into the exchange rate.
Thank you.
Yes, though on the
thank you.
margin, if the exchange rate does weaken
That's good, Governor.
going forward, that will create, that will create more important inflation, and it's something we need to look at in our own setting of interest
Thank you,
rates.
and thank you, MP Morantz. And now over to MP Chattel to finish off this round.
Oui, merci beaucoup, merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us, Governor. And bravo on your excellent work. The Bank of Canada is such an important institution. Its independence is highly appreciated, and your policies are starting to bear fruit. We see that. I'd like to follow up on my colleague. I'd like to understand Canada's economic resilience. I was looking at the IMF report, a recent report that provides economic forecasts for many different economies, and they note that Canada, once again, will have better outcomes than comparable countries. You agreed with my colleague, but you didn't explain what makes us quite unique in this situation. What are the factors? Is it the fact that we attract talent? Is it because of our natural resources? Is it because of the stability of our economy, our AAA rating? What means that we get out of this better than other countries? Yes, I just came out of IMF meetings last week. Yes, you're right. Forecasts for Canada are very good. There's a growth rate of 1.5 that's a little higher than ours generally, but the factors, I think you pointed out many important factors. We have a diversified economy with manufacturing and services and commodities. We have a well-educated population, a lot of talent. The growth rate of our labor force is higher than other G7 countries because of the fact that we have more immigration than many other countries. So, yes, we have many advantages. And it's always good to use one's advantages and address one's weaknesses. Thank you very much. You said on other occasions that world banking systems are experiencing some tension right now. I have constituents that are worried. They see what's happening in the international banking system or in the United States and are wondering, what are the repercussions for the Canadian banking systems? We do know that we have good, solid institutions. They have faced many crises, but I'd like to know your thoughts on that. The effects of the problems in the United States and Switzerland have very little effect here in Canada. Our system, as I said in my answers to Mr. Sainte-Marie, we have a national banking system. It's a strong system. During the world economic crisis in 2008-9, there was no bankruptcy of banks, no failure of banks. Here in Canada, it was even stronger than it used to be because the quality has gone even higher since then. So the system here in Canada is very stable and strong. It is very important for banks to manage risk. It's always important to have a good supervision system as we have here in Canada. So that should continue. In the United States and Switzerland, authorities responded very quickly and strongly, and that did stabilize the world banking system, but it's always possible that there'll be other events. It's important for us to be ready for that. Thank you. Thank you.
Few seconds, but if you want to make one comment, and then we're going to move on to actually our final. Go ahead.
Quickly say that we hear a lot about, spending may create inflation if we give money to people that needs it. But to me, cutting taxes is the same. It's just an indirect way to give more money to people, and especially if it's upper class, then of course it's more money for consuming and create inflation as well. So thank you.
Thank you again, MP Chattel. And so, members, just looking at the time, as we do in this committee, we look, if we don't have time for a full round, what we're going to do is divide the time up amongst all parties. And we're going to start with the Conservatives. You'll have up to 5-6 minutes, and you can also amongst yourselves divvy up that time.
Thank you, Chair. Governor, in the monetary policy report, there's a headline that says in it, fiscal measures adding to the growth of domestic demand. Just a quick question. Is that a polite way of saying that it's adding to inflation?
It's a polite way of saying it's adding to domestic demand. It's adding to growth in the economy. The government spending is running roughly in line with potential output, so it is contributing to growth in the economy. It's not contributing to the slowing, and as I said, we actually need some slowing in the economy to get inflation down.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's one of the first times I've heard you relate the two, fiscal and monetary policy together, so thank you for that. I wanted to continue the questioning I had on the public service growing by 30%. I didn't get a full answer on that. The consultants are getting up to $21.4 billion into the budget. It's growing. We know the labor market is tightening, as you said. Labor shortages are wreaking havoc all the way around, and it's costing more to hire people. We know there's going to be a lot more immigration coming in, but it's hypothetical to say that that's going to cover the labor shortages that we have in the country, because we don't know if that's actually going to solve anything. But we do know it might cause a housing shortage and a problem with the housing market. That's for sure. But would you agree that the public service expansion is making the tightening of the labor market worse?
We don't sort of target every sector. We look at the labor market overall. I'm just looking at a table in our monetary policy report, and there are various public sectors in here, and what you can see is that
Ms. Rogers in the previous answer said that the immigration would help solve that problem, but it doesn't seem like that's what your answer is. Because
immigration
I think you're right
immigration will
different
help.
sectors have different outcomes.
Immigration will help ease pressures in the labor market, but as Ms. Rogers was outlining, if you have an economy that starts in excess demand and you add new labor, new workers add supply, but it also adds demand because they need houses, they go shopping, they need, and so if you start in excess demand and you add both supply and demand, you're still in excess demand. So there's still some work for monetary policy to get down. Higher immigration means that our economy overall can grow faster without creating inflationary pressure, but it doesn't by itself relieve the excess demand in the economy.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up on that. I want to talk about housing. We know the government plans to bring about 1 million immigrants in, 500,000 regular, and the rest temporary foreign workers and students. But Budget 2023 plans $1.5 billion to make 4,500 spaces available and another $4 billion for 100,000 spaces. We already don't have enough places to live. So how inflationary do you expect the gap between those two plans to be?
Just very quickly, if you look at our own projections, we expect. Housing market has weakened considerably with largely reflecting the higher interest rates and to some extent the fact that as people we came out of COVID. We didn't all want to stay home all the time, and we got out a little bit more. But certainly higher interest rates have had a pretty big dampening effect on housing. Housing prices are coming down nationally. They're down about 15%. We do expect housing to remain subdued, but as you get into the second half of the year, yes, we do expect to see it'll probably start growing again. And one of the reasons is exactly what you cited. We've got high rates of immigration. That sort of that provides sort of an underpinning of demand.
Another pressure.
And then it really gets back to the issue.
Another question for you. You mentioned that wage growth is expected to be 4.5%, and that economic growth is declining at the same time. And so I'm interested in your view on the labor negotiations that are going on across the country and how that is going to affect inflation and interest rates.
Well, you won't be surprised. We're not going to comment on individual labor negotiations. Those are between employers and their workers. What I will say, and I've been saying this actually for a good 6 months, and I've been saying it to businesses, I've been saying it to workers, to governments, to Canadians, anybody who wants to listen, you should plan on inflation coming down. Inflation is coming down. It's 4.3 this morning. We think it's going to be 3 by the summer, 2.5 by the end of the year. And so whatever kind of contract you're signing, you should be thinking that inflation is coming down.
Excellent. And in terms of corporate pricing behaviors, is there anything that you think the Government of Canada could do to incentivize the right behavior to minimize inflationary pressure?
There are certainly competition questions, and we're going to leave it to the Competition Bureau to look at issues of competition. I think from our perspective, we need to get the economy, we need to get demand and supply into better balance, because as long as demand is running ahead of supply, it's too easy for companies to pass through higher price increases. They don't need to worry about losing customers. And so that is something. We are watching corporate pricing behavior closely. It is certainly beginning to normalize, but we're not back to normal yet. And our commitment is to restore price stability, because when you have price stability, those competitive forces are stronger. Because if everybody's expecting inflation to be low and stable, when a business goes and increases their prices, customers notice that, and they say, I'm just going to go shop somewhere else. And companies know that, so they become more hesitant to pass through big price increases. And that gives you this sort of reinforcing stability of competitive forces working, and that is one of the reasons why we got to get back to inflation.
Thank you, MP Gladue, and welcome to our committee. And over to MP Baker.
Thanks very much, Chair, and I'm going to share my time with Mr. Beach. Mr. Macklem, Ms. Rogers, thank you very much for being here again and for all of your hard work in trying to tackle what, for most of my constituents, has been their number one challenge and their number one priority, which is the rising cost of living and the affordability challenges that come with that. So I thank you for your leadership and your work in that regard. I'd like to, Governor, if I may, just start with summarizing for the folks watching at home who haven't been able to watch this entire hearing, some of the key takeaways I've taken away from what you've said, and you can tell me if I'm misspeaking or mischaracterizing what you've said. So what I've heard you say today is, well, you haven't said this, but inflation in Canada was at a high of about 8.1% this past summer. We're now, based on today's figures, at around annual inflation of 4.3%. Your inflation projection is that inflation will be 3% sometime this summer, 2.5% by the end of this year, and reaching your target of 2% by the end of 2024. On the unemployment rate, we're currently around a historic low of around 5%, and it's projected to stay low, though it could vary a little bit, but it's projected to stay low. You're not expecting large increases in unemployment. And then in terms of wage growth, we're projecting that it'll continue to be strong, at least for the short term, and you're projecting that the economy will continue to grow. Is that a fair summary of some of the things you've said today?
Yes, I think the only thing I would add, though, is that we do need to see some moderation in wage growth. We need to see those service prices come down for that inflation forecast to come true.
One of the things that I noted is that you used to be a board member at Scotiabank. Many years prior to that, I was a commercial banker at Scotiabank. So I won't blame you for all the loans that I proposed internally with the bank that were turned down from my clients. But as someone who's worked in risk management and knows so much about that field, I think you can appreciate, and I can appreciate as someone who tried to extend loans to clients, the impact that interest rates have on borrowing costs. And that's one of the things I get asked about a lot by my constituents in Etobicoke Centre is, where are interest rates going? Either these are homeowners or prospective owners looking to buy a home and thinking about their mortgage rates, or they're business owners looking to borrow money to invest and grow their businesses. What would you tell Canadians about where you expect interest rates to go?
Well, that's always a tricky question because we take one interest rate decision at a time. But we've raised rates, over the last year, we raised rates very rapidly. For our last two decisions, we have held the policy rate at 4.5%. And we're using this pause as the opportunity to assess whether we've raised interest rates enough to get inflation all the way back to target. So we can't rule out that interest rates may need to go higher to get inflation back to target. The other thing, certainly we discussed in our recent deliberations, is the extent to which interest rates may need to stay higher for longer, depending on how quickly inflation comes down to the target. So, as we started the day, there is certainly some good news. Inflation is coming down. But as I emphasized, to get it back to 2% target, there's some more things that need to happen. We're going to be watching those things closely.
Thank you very much for that, and I'll pass the rest of my time to Mr. Beach.
Thank you, MP Baker. MP Beach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Colleagues, out of respect for the governor, I will keep this relatively short. And I've already given a heads up to the critics of each party. I've asked the clerk to circulate the following notice, which I've provided in both official languages. It reads that should a Budget Implementation Act be tabled in the House, the committee commence a pre-study of said legislation, and that the committee invite officials to provide briefings on the contents of the bill, as well as the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. This is for notice only. I'm not intending to move the motion at this time. On a related matter, I'll remind all Finance Committee members of the technical briefing on the BIA that's taking place tonight. It should be fun. If there's any time left over, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to pass the floor back to Mr. Baker.
Okay, well, your definition of fun, MP Beach, and I think it's at 6 o'clock tonight, members, is when that's happening. Is that correct, MP Beach, so everybody's aware?
Yeah, everybody has noticed. It probably happened just after votes.
Okay, great. And okay, thank you. And now we are moving to the block. And MP Sainte-Marie, please.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Juste être certain, il reste.
Thank you. I just want to make sure there's no more time left for Mr. Baker to finish the minutes for the Liberal Party. No.
Our MP Baker is done. Yes, so he's finished. Yes,
merci.
MP Sainte-Marie.
Merci.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. I'm very pleased to be with you in any event, at least virtually. Mr. McClem, do you believe that the recent bank failures that we saw recently could harm the development of clean technology or green financing? I didn't properly hear the end of your question. Did the failures of the banks have implications for what? For clean technology or the development of green financing? The recent problems in the banks are problems with traditional systems. So there wasn't much involvement of technology. You're right that SVB and Signature Bank were banks used by the technology sector. And one thing that's striking is the speed with which deposits flew out of these banks. It's probably related to the fact that customers, SVB especially, were very highly concentrated in one sector and communicated via social media. And use digital banking and can withdraw their deposits very quickly. And that was one aspect of this bankruptcy, is it went so fast. It's true that worldwide, the Basel Committee, for instance, is examining the implications of this for liquidity and the calibration of liquidity. So it raises issues that the Financial Stability Board is examining right now. Okay, thank you very much. On a whole other topic, M.O. Kruger, an economist who was at the IMF and the World Bank and is now at Stanford University, is worried about the IMF and other institutions regarding countries that have high debt. With the emergence of China as a private lender to these countries, that affects support for developing countries. I'd like to hear your opinion on that phenomenon. Is there a risk that we'll see debt crises in developing countries? And given the new situation, are international institutions well positioned to absorb these crises? I agree, there is a risk. Managing sovereign debt is always difficult. There are more players now. China is a huge player. Yes. What we have seen up till now is that the process is slower. It takes more time to address these situations. And yes, it involves some risk. I think that from our perspective as Canadians, the IMF is a very important institution. It has an important role to play. We work very hard with the IMF. The IMF has a great deal of capacity to help the countries that experience these problems. And I think that countries that need to use these programs should be encouraged to speak to the IMF. Thank you very much. One last question on another topic again. In your analyses, do you see a multiplying effect of the government, the federal government's spending and the tax cuts? Is this public information? Do you model that? And if so, can you describe how significant it is? Yes, we do try. We're not the experts at all these fiscal issues, but yes, we do look at different types of government spending. It can be tax reduction, investment in infrastructure, healthcare, education, and these different kinds of spending can have multiplicator effects. At a quite high level, we try to control for that, and we have a few studies on various multipliers. But overall, investments such as infrastructure tend to have quite a high multiplying effect because all the money goes into the economy, they hire more people, so it has a higher multiplying effect. The multiplier tends to be lower for individuals because they will spend part of that transfer. So yes, we try to control for that when we do our forecasts. It's not just the quantity of the spending in the budget, but it's the kinds of things they are spending on. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sainte-Marie.
MP Blakey, you'll be our final questioner of the Governor or Senior Deputy Governor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And just briefly on the business item that Mr. Beach raised, I do believe at some point we had talked about the possibility, and I know last year we did, in fact, send letters to other committees asking them to look at certain sections of the Budget Implementation Act. Obviously not in a position to do that yet because the bill hasn't been tabled. But I do think it would be helpful to have a draft letter, and I don't believe this is the first time I've said that. I haven't seen a draft letter, and I think that if the committee is interested in pursuing this as a strategy this year, we should see one soon so that it can be part of our deliberations on Mr. Beach's motion when he chooses to move it. So I just want to lay that down as a marker for you, Mr. Chair, and the clerk to please get us a draft so that we can take a look at that.
Thank you, MP Blakey.
Thank you. And then on the question, we talked a little bit about this kind of negative amortization that's going on with the extension of amortization periods that banks have undertaken in order to prevent default on mortgages, which I think is, I recognize that is a way for banks to protect their profit. I also recognize that that's a really important thing for Canadians right now who are in a difficult space. And if they weren't able to extend their amortization period, they would likely be out of a home. And so that's had a kind of stabilizing effect, which I think may be working to some extent at cross purposes with the monetary policy of the bank. But we've also seen that monetary policy has been able to reduce inflation, notwithstanding the fact that this activity is going on, and there's certainly a benefit to Canadian households that I approve of. Employment insurance can operate in a similar fashion when we see, challenging outcomes for Canadian families, and the extent of employment insurance being available can have impacts on demand and supply. So I recognize that you don't want to comment on employment insurance as a fiscal policy, but I would be curious to know how the bank incorporates the adequacy of employment insurance into its forecasts for supply and demand at a macro level when you're thinking about the impact of interest rates on the economy. And so if you could just kind of give us a little bit of insight into how or whether you consider employment insurance policy as bearing on the impact for Canadian families, or just the kind of macro analysis that you have of the economy?
I think you're going to be a bit disappointed with this answer. We don't model the employment insurance system directly. In our macro models, we do model the extent to which there are automatic stabilizers in the economy, because and largely we do that based on sort of historically, when the economy slowed, how much did government revenue go down, how much did government expenditure go up, what is the sort of automatic stabilizing effect that has. So we sort of take the average stabilizing effect that we can observe over history, and we use that in our models going forward. We don't sort of go a level deeper and model the various parts of those automatic stabilizers. Obviously, employment insurance is one part. But we really sort of look at the overall impact. And get back to your previous question, I think automatic stabilizers do play an important role in the economy, and you want those to be effective. Then there's a lot of difficult discussions about how big do you want them to be, and all those sort of questions. And I'm going to leave those questions to you.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for your time here today. I think a colleague of mine earlier expressed appreciation for your willingness to accept our invitations to appear here at committee. I certainly echo that. I also, commend you for forecasting my disappointment in the answer. I know forecasting is your business, and you certainly excelled here today. But thank you, nevertheless, for hazarding an answer of some kind to a question that falls a little bit outside your normal purview.
Thank you. Thank you, MP Blakey. And just on behalf of all the committee members and the clerk, the analysts, all the interpreters, and thank you for coming regularly. We thank Governor Macklem, Senior Deputy Governor Rogers. We really appreciate the time that you give us and the many questions that you've answered. Thanks for your testimony and for help with this study. We appreciate it. So just on MP Blakey's question, so the clerk is finding the draft letter that we sent out the last time, and we'll distribute that to all the members. Okay, thank you, and that will conclude our meeting.
Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to coming back.